The sharp crack of a gunshot cuts through the quiet night air, shattering the calm of Sarah's home. She freezes for a split second, her breath catching in her throat. Time feels suspended, as though the world has paused to listen to the chilling sound. Then, her heart begins to race, the weight of the noise sinking in, and a cold shiver runs down her spine. Emma, her disabled daughter, is out there in the yard, the same yard that had become the battleground in an escalating feud with the HOA president, Karen. Panic surges through Sarah's veins as she leaps to her feet, her legs shaking with the fear she can no longer control. She stumbles toward the window, her fingers trembling as they grip the curtains. The scene outside is eerily still. The only movement is the wind rustling the leaves in the trees. Sarah's mind spins. Was that a warning shot? A mistake? Or had it hit Emma? Her breath comes in ragged gasps, her stomach twisting in dread. Sarah's legs carry her out the door before she even consciously realizes it. She's running now through the dark, silent house, her mind focused only on one thing: Emma. Reaching the backyard, Sarah's eyes scan frantically, searching for her daughter in the dim light. Her heart is pounding so hard it feels like it might burst. She sees Emma lying motionless on the ground just a few feet away. Her heart stops. Sarah kneels beside her, her hands shaking as she reaches for Emma's limp body, praying for some sign of life. Any movement, a breath, a pulse. Emma? Baby, please, Sarah whispers, her voice cracking with fear. The air around her feels suffocating, thick with dread. Every second feels like an eternity as she frantically checks for any signs of life, her heart racing faster with each passing moment. The faintest flutter of Emma's eyelids sends a jolt of relief through Sarah, but it's fleeting. Emma's face is pale, her lips tinged with blue. She tries to speak, but only a rasp escapes her throat. Mom, she whispers weakly. The relief that washes over Sarah is quickly replaced by rage, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Karen has gone too far. She can't let this stand. Emma was just caught in the crossfire of a war she never asked for. Now, the question echoes in Sarah's mind. Will she lose her daughter tonight? Or is this just the beginning of a battle that will change their lives forever? The suspense builds, the weight of the situation heavier than ever before. This is not just a property dispute anymore. This is about survival. And Sarah won't stop until justice is served. The morning after the gunshot is a blur for Sarah. The rhythmic beep of the hospital machines is the only sound that fills the sterile room where Emma lies unconscious, her body hooked up to monitors. Sarah watches over her, her eyes red from lack of sleep, a burning mix of fear and anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. She's holding on, but the hospital lights only serve to make the pain of the previous day seem even more surreal. Everything that happened after that confrontation outside feels like a nightmare she can't wake from. But it wasn't a nightmare. It was real. The day before, everything had been so ordinary. Sarah and Emma had spent the morning curled up on the couch, a blanket draped over them as they watched an old movie. Nothing special, just another quiet day in their home. Emma had laughed at a silly scene. The sound of her joy, the only thing that kept Sarah's world grounded. They had shared lunch together, and for a brief moment, Sarah allowed herself to believe that life was normal, that the ongoing property dispute with Karen, the HOA president, was just a small annoyance they'd eventually get over. But that afternoon, Sarah had received the letter. The HOA was escalating their demands on the property, claiming that Sarah's fencing was violating community guidelines. The letter was filled with legal jargon and threats of fines, or worse, the removal of the fence altogether. It had come as a shock. Sarah had carefully followed all the regulations when she built it, and the HOA had never mentioned any issues before. But that didn't matter to Karen. It never did. By the time Sarah called her, her patience had worn thin. She needed answers. Karen, this has gone far enough, she had said firmly, the stress from the past few weeks creeping into her voice. I've followed every rule, and now you're threatening to take my fence down? What is going on? Karen's voice on the other end of the line was icy, almost mocking. "Oh, Sarah, don't act so surprised. You always think you're above the rules, don't you?" Her words dripped with condescension. "The fence doesn't comply with the aesthetic guidelines. You know the community rules, Sarah. If you don't fix it, there will be consequences. It's not my fault you can't seem to follow simple directions." Sarah's blood boiled. Karen had always had an air of superiority about her, but now she could see that it was more than just a personality flaw. Karen's power within the HOA gave her a sense of entitlement, an unwavering belief that she could do whatever she wanted, regardless of the damage it caused. Sarah tried to stay calm, but her frustration mounted. "This is ridiculous, Karen. This is my property, and I've done everything by the book. You can't just dictate how I live." Karen laughed, but it wasn't the laugh of someone amused. It was cold, dismissive. "You'll learn to respect the community. I'm not the one who needs a change, Sarah. It's you. You better fix that fence, or I'll make sure it gets taken down." Sarah clenched her fists, but she forced herself to take a deep breath. "You don't scare me, Karen. You don't control me. I'll see you in court if that's what it takes." The call ended with Karen's sharp words still ringing in Sarah's ears. The sense of injustice was overwhelming. But Sarah had no idea that this was only the beginning. When she went to bed that night, she tried to push it all out of her mind. Emma had fallen asleep beside her, her breathing steady and peaceful. For a moment, Sarah allowed herself the comfort of thinking that maybe everything would be okay, but it wasn't. The next day, Karen showed up at the house unannounced. Sarah was in the front yard, preparing to take Emma to the park, when Karen pulled into the driveway. The confrontation was inevitable, but it still shocked Sarah when Karen stepped out of her car, her expression tight and furious. "I told you to take that fence down," Karen spat, her eyes narrowing. "I'm giving you one last chance. Remove it, or I'll make sure you pay for your stubbornness." Sarah didn't back down. "You've crossed the line, Karen. I'm not afraid of you. I won't let you intimidate me into submission." The words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment it seemed like they might actually resolve the issue. But Karen's face twisted into something darker, more dangerous. Her lips curled into a sneer, her hands trembling slightly. "You really think you can stand against me? You think you can win?" She stepped closer, her voice lower, almost a whisper. "You're going to regret this, Sarah." Just as Sarah was about to respond, she felt a sudden shift in the air. Karen reached into her bag, pulling out a gun. "I warned you," she said coldly, her hand shaking just slightly as she aimed the weapon at Sarah. "This is your last chance." Sarah froze. The world seemed to stop. Karen wasn't just threatening her anymore. She was ready to make it real. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with fear and anger, and just as quickly as it had begun, the shot rang out, sending Sarah's heart into overdrive. That was when the nightmare truly began. The moment the gunshot rang out, everything shifted. Time seemed to warp, a blur of chaos and adrenaline. Sarah's heart stopped in her chest as she watched Karen's arm snap forward, the pistol raised with an almost eerie precision. The sound of the shot shattered the tension, and for a split second, everything was suspended in a bubble of disbelief. The world around Sarah seemed to slow, the only thing in focus being the figure of Karen, her face cold with determination. Before Sarah could process what was happening, she saw Emma crumple to the ground, her body falling to the cold grass as though time itself had folded her into the earth. The horror hit Sarah like a slap to the face, a surge of fear so raw it stole the air from her lungs. She froze for just a moment, every instinct in her body telling her to rush to her daughter's side, but the shock kept her rooted to the spot. "Emma!" Sarah screamed, her voice cracking with terror. The word felt like it was ripped from her throat as she sprinted forward, her heart slamming in her chest. She fell beside Emma, her hands trembling as she checked her daughter's pulse, frantic, panicked. There was blood, so much blood. But the worst part was the stillness, the haunting quiet that filled the yard as Sarah pressed her fingers to Emma's neck. The beating of her heart was drowned by the deafening silence, but then the faintest pulse. Emma was alive. Barely. Before Sarah could gather herself, the voice of Karen sliced through the chaos like a knife, cold and unapologetic. It was a warning shot, Sarah, she said, her voice unnervingly calm, as if she had done nothing more than swat a fly. She's fine. I only meant to scare you. You shouldn't have pushed me. The words hit Sarah like a freight train, confusion and anger welling up in her chest. A warning shot? How could she even think that was an acceptable explanation? The rage bubbling inside her was beyond anything she had ever felt. She couldn't even bring herself to look at Karen. Not yet, not while her daughter was lying in a pool of her own blood. Are you insane? Sarah managed to choke out, her voice trembling with fury. You shot my daughter. You could have killed her. The rawness of her words, the disbelief in her tone, only made Karen's indifference seem even more terrifying. Karen's eyes flicked to Sarah's face, her lips curling into a tight, self-assured smile. You're overreacting. It was just a little warning. She's fine. It was your fault for pushing me too far. She was so casual about it, as if she were discussing something trivial, something inconsequential. It only made Sarah's fury burn hotter. Get out, Sarah spat, her hands shaking with the fury she could barely contain. She wasn't asking, she was demanding. Get out of my yard. Now. But Karen didn't move. She didn't even flinch. I don't think you understand how things work around here, she said, the malice in her voice cutting deeper than Sarah had expected. This is my neighborhood, my community, and I'm just getting started with you, Sarah. If you think this was bad, just wait. It was the final straw. The anger, the terror, the betrayal, all of it crashed down on Sarah at once. She could feel the heat of it in her chest, an intense fire that screamed for justice. This wasn't just about a property dispute anymore. This was about Emma's life. This was about everything Karen had taken from them. Sarah knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that nothing would ever be the same again. The lines had been drawn, and the battle had begun. Sarah's gaze never left Karen as she reached for her phone, dialing 911, her voice a trembling but determined promise. You'll pay for this. But she knew deep down that this wasn't just a legal fight now. It was a war. And Sarah was going to do whatever it took to win. The next few hours after the incident felt like a blur for Sarah. The flashing lights of the ambulance, the sterile hospital hallways, and the sound of doctors' voices were all jumbled together in her mind, but none of it truly reached her. Nothing registered except for Emma, lying on the cold hospital bed, her face pale, her breathing shallow. Sarah hadn't left her daughter's side since they had arrived, gripping Emma's hand so tightly that her knuckles ached, her mind still reeling from the words Karen had said. It was just a warning shot. Sarah couldn't shake the image of Emma collapsing in front of her, the gunshot ringing in her ears, the cold indifference in Karen's voice. The reality of what had happened was just starting to hit her, and a fire of determination ignited in her chest. The doctors had done their part. The bullet hadn't hit any major organs, but Emma was in critical condition, heavily sedated, and her chances of a full recovery still uncertain. The physical wounds might heal, but the emotional scars were far deeper, and Sarah knew she couldn't leave the situation unresolved. She couldn't let Karen walk away scot-free, not when her daughter was lying in a hospital bed because of her. After hours of waiting, Sarah was finally allowed to step into the hospital corridor to make some calls. She wasn't sure where to start, but she knew she had to move quickly. Her first call was to the police. The officer who answered sounded bored and uninterested, clearly not grasping the gravity of the situation. Ma'am, we have your report on file. If your daughter's injuries were truly caused by Karen, then it's being handled. It's just a misunderstanding. We'll look into it. Don't worry, he assured her almost dismissively. Sarah's heart clenched. A misunderstanding, she demanded, her voice shaking with both anger and disbelief. She shot my daughter. Do you hear me? My daughter is in the hospital because of her, and you're telling me it's a misunderstanding? What does that even mean? There was a pause on the line, and then the officer sighed. I understand you're upset, but we've got our hands full with other cases. We'll get to it. Just try to stay calm. We'll contact you when we have more information. But that wasn't good enough. Sarah knew she couldn't rely on the police to take her daughter's case seriously, not when the HOA had deep pockets and connections, and Karen was clearly well versed in using her influence to get away with anything. If Sarah wanted justice, she'd have to take matters into her own hands. She hung up, her mind racing. The first thing she did was reach out to anyone who might have witnessed the shooting. She needed evidence. She needed to prove that Karen had gone too far. It wasn't long before Sarah tracked down Megan, a neighbor who had been watching from her window when the incident occurred. Megan had been hesitant at first, but after hearing Sarah's plea for help, she agreed to meet. When they sat down together at a nearby cafe, Megan looked around nervously as if afraid of getting involved. "I don't want to get into trouble," she said, quietly, her voice barely audible above the hum of the cafe. "But I saw it all. Karen came over, and she was yelling at you. I couldn't hear everything, but I saw her pull out the gun. I thought she was just going to scare you, but then she shot." Sarah felt her stomach twist with the weight of the confirmation. Megan wasn't the only one who had seen it, though. Over the next few days, Sarah visited more neighbors, piecing together the accounts of people who had witnessed the confrontation. Some of them were too afraid to speak up, intimidated by Karen's power within the community, but a few were willing to help. They confirmed that Karen had escalated the situation, yelling and threatening Sarah before pulling the gun. With this information, Sarah knew she needed more. She couldn't rely on just the witnesses. She had to gather concrete proof. The next step was the security footage from the street cameras, a long shot, but worth the try. Sarah went to the local convenience store where the camera had been pointed directly at the street corner near her house, hoping the footage would reveal the crucial moment when Karen fired the gun. After some convincing and a promise to keep the details private, the store manager reluctantly agreed to hand over the footage. Sarah watched the video over and over, her eyes glued to the screen, praying for something that would give her the leverage she needed. When she finally saw it, the quick motion of Karen raising the gun and firing, Sarah could barely breathe. It was as clear as day. Karen had aimed at Emma with intent, and the entire world could now see the truth. She had no excuses left, but even with this evidence in hand, Sarah knew it wouldn't be easy. Karen's legal team would fight back, and the community would rally around her. Sarah could already feel the weight of the system pressing down on her, trying to dismiss the situation as a simple accident, something that wasn't worth the effort. But Sarah wasn't going to let Karen get away with it. The next few days were a whirlwind of legal consultations. She met with a lawyer who specialized in personal injury and criminal defense. The lawyer listened patiently, then shook his head. "It's going to be a tough fight," he said, his voice full of concern. "Karen will claim self-defense. Her legal team will argue that she was merely protecting her property. But with the witnesses, the footage, and Emma's injuries, we have a chance to make them pay. But it won't be easy. Expect them to come at you hard." Sarah felt the pressure mount, but she wasn't backing down. She couldn't. Not now. Not after everything Karen had done to her family. The investigation was far from over, and Sarah was just getting started. Each piece of evidence, each witness statement, only fueled her determination. She knew the road ahead would be long, but she also knew that she would stop at nothing to see Karen held accountable for what she had done. The fight for justice had only just begun. Just as Sarah felt a glimmer of hope, everything began to unravel. She had spent the past few weeks gathering evidence, consulting with her lawyer, and preparing for what she thought was a clear path to justice. The security footage, the eyewitness statements, the reports from the hospital, it all seemed like the perfect case against Karen. Her lawyer was confident, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the cusp of something major. But everything changed the moment she got a call from Detective Thompson, the lead investigator assigned to Emma's case. His voice on the phone was different, colder than before. "I need you to come in for a meeting." "Sarah," he said, his tone abrupt, "we found something, and you need to hear it in person." A knot tightened in Sarah's stomach. What could it be? Had something gone wrong? Her mind raced as she made her way to the police station. When she arrived, Detective Thompson was waiting for her in a small, dimly lit room. He didn't offer his usual reassuring smile, instead, gesturing for her to sit across from him. "There's something I need to show you," he said, sliding a folder across the table. Sarah's fingers trembled as she opened the folder, her eyes scanning the documents inside. It didn't take long for the weight of the situation to hit her. The first document was an internal police memo, dated only a few days ago, detailing a meeting between Karen and several officers. Her heart sank as she saw the names of the officers involved, names that Sarah recognized from previous encounters with the department. "Karen's influence goes deeper than we thought," Detective Thompson said, his voice low. "She's been in contact with some of the higher-ups in the police force. More than that, she's been pulling strings behind the scenes to ensure the investigation goes nowhere." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean? How far does this go?" The detective hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It's not just the police, Sarah. There's a network of influence within the HOA, one that Karen has been part of for years. Several members of the local government are involved, and they've been making sure the case gets buried. I've been digging, but the closer I get, the more roadblocks appear." The truth hit Sarah like a freight train. All along, she had believed that Karen was a singular malicious force, a woman so fixated on power that she would go to any lengths to get what she wanted. But now she realized that Karen was not just a petty tyrant. She was the puppet master, pulling strings that reached far beyond the confines of her own petty disputes. Sarah's mind raced. The police officers, the local officials, the HOA, it was all connected. Karen had built a system, a network that allowed her to manipulate the very institutions that were supposed to protect people like Sarah. Everything Sarah had worked for, every piece of evidence she had collected, was now at risk of being silenced by the very forces she thought would help her. "You're telling me this whole case could be compromised because of Karen's connections?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with disbelief. "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Thompson replied, his eyes dark with frustration. "The system is stacked against you, Sarah. Karen's got the leverage to make sure this never sees a courtroom. The more I dig, the more I find, and the uglier it gets. If we don't act fast, she'll get away with it all." Sarah felt the world spin around her. For weeks, she had believed that justice was within her reach. She thought the truth would win, that the police would do their job, that the evidence would speak for itself. But now, with the realization that the very institutions she had trusted were tainted, her sense of hope was replaced by the bitter taste of betrayal. But in the midst of the shock and the overwhelming sense of defeat, something inside Sarah stirred. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. Karen thought she could hide behind her network, her connections, her power. But Sarah wasn't going to let her. If anything, the revelation of Karen's manipulation only fueled Sarah's determination. The stakes had just been raised higher than she ever imagined. And now Sarah had to fight harder than ever to bring the truth to light. With the walls closing in, Sarah knew that the only way out was to keep pushing forward. Karen had underestimated her. And now, Sarah was going to show her just how far she would go to take back her daughter's life and to make Karen pay for the damage she had caused. The courtroom was suffocating. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of papers and the measured voices of the attorneys as they presented their cases. Sarah sat at the plaintiff's table, her back straight, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She had never imagined herself in this position, not just as a mother fighting for her child's justice, but as a symbol of the strength she never knew she had. Emma's face flashed in her mind, pale and bruised from the night of the shooting, and she felt a surge of both rage and resolve. Across from her, Karen sat confidently at the defense table, her cold, calculating eyes locked onto the judge. The once immovable force that had seemed untouchable now looked vulnerable, but she wasn't showing it. Karen's lawyer, a slick, well-groomed man, was making his closing arguments, his voice smooth and assured. He spoke with a practiced ease, his words designed to plant doubt in the minds of the jury. "Members of the jury," he began, his tone deliberately calm, "what we have here is a tragic accident. Karen acted out of fear for her safety and the safety of her community. The plaintiff, Sarah, and her daughter, Emma, have been caught in an unfortunate situation, but Karen had no intention of causing harm. This was a mere warning shot. The evidence simply doesn't support the claims of a malicious intent. Sarah clenched her jaw, her heart pounding in her chest. Karen had the audacity to sit there, to pretend that this was some kind of accident, to paint herself as the victim. She could already see Karen's strategy: make it all about the accidental nature of the incident, portray herself as someone who simply acted in self-defense. The evidence, the witnesses, the video footage, none of it seemed to matter to Karen. She was trying to manipulate the narrative again, just like she always did. The defense lawyer paused, letting his words hang in the air. He turned to the jury, making eye contact with each of them, subtly trying to sway their judgment. We are all aware of how much of a burden this case has been on Karen. It is a burden that no one should have to endure. She has suffered immensely, both emotionally and financially. This trial and the accusations levied against her have taken a toll on her reputation, on her personal life. The actions she took were the result of a moment of fear, a mother's instinct, a community leader's duty to protect. That is what you should remember when you deliberate. A moment of fear and protection. Not malice, not intent. Sarah felt the anger rising inside her like a flood. This was it. Karen was trying to frame herself as the victim, to absolve herself of all responsibility. She couldn't let Karen get away with this. Not after everything. The judge nodded, signaling for Sarah's lawyer to present the closing argument. Sarah's lawyer, a seasoned but humble woman named Lily, stood up and approached the jury with a calm and focused presence. She laid out the facts of the case, the overwhelming evidence that had built up against Karen. Members of the jury, what we have here is not an act of fear, but an act of aggression. Karen's own words after the shooting, as well as the evidence presented in this case, paint a clear picture. This was not a warning shot. This was a deliberate act. A woman with power, a woman with connections who felt she was above the law, and who acted out of personal vengeance. There was no threat to her. There was no danger to her or her property. Karen made a conscious decision to escalate the situation, and Emma paid the price for it. The room was silent as Lily's words settled in. Sarah could see the jury members' faces, the flickers of understanding, the weight of the truth dawning on them. She could feel the shift in the room. They were starting to understand the true nature of what had happened. But Karen wasn't finished. She had one last trick up her sleeve, and she wasn't going to give up that easily. Her lawyer stood and objected. Objection, Your Honor. We have already established that this was a moment of self-defense. This line of questioning is irrelevant. The judge raised his hand, silencing the room. Sustained, he said sharply. But Sarah wasn't going to let that stop her. This was her moment, her last chance to expose Karen for who she truly was. She stood up, interrupting the proceedings, her voice strong, clear, and unwavering. Your Honor, Sarah began, her eyes locked onto Karen. I have one more thing to show the court. I have one more piece of evidence that Karen can't deny. The truth will come out. I won't let her manipulate this case anymore. The room grew quiet as all eyes turned to her. The judge gave a nod, signaling that Sarah could proceed. With trembling hands, Sarah held up a sealed envelope, the final piece of the puzzle. She handed it to her lawyer, who tore it open and handed it to the judge. It was a letter from Karen's former assistant, an anonymous tip that had been carefully sealed. Your Honor, Sarah said, this letter is from someone who worked closely with Karen for years. Someone who knew the extent of Karen's influence and the kind of person she truly is. The letter outlines in detail how Karen had planned to take down the entire HOA board, how she had manipulated them, used threats to silence her neighbors, and how she had bragged about making sure Sarah and her daughter would be the next victims. This was not a warning shot. It was a calculated move to intimidate, to eliminate anyone who stood in her way. The courtroom was dead silent. Karen's face drained of color as the letter was read aloud, the words ringing in her ears like a death knell. There's no escaping this now. No clever defense, no manipulation. Sarah had just sealed Karen's fate. The look in Karen's eyes shifted from arrogance to desperation. Her lips trembled, her hands clenched into fists. For the first time in this entire trial, she looked truly vulnerable. She had lost control. The world she had built was crumbling, and all that was left was the truth. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she watched Karen crumble. The finality of the moment was overwhelming, but Sarah had done it. She had faced the most powerful woman in the room and exposed her for what she truly was. The victory was sweet, but it was hard-earned. This wasn't just about justice for Emma. This was about taking down a system of power that had allowed someone like Karen to abuse her position for far too long. As the judge banged the gavel, declaring the verdict, Sarah stood tall, her eyes never leaving Karen. Karen had lost, and for the first time, Sarah felt the weight of the fight lifting from her shoulders. The battle had been long, but the war was over. The trial was over. The gavel had fallen, and Karen was led away in cuffs, her life collapsing around her. Sarah sat in the quiet of the courtroom for a moment longer than she needed to, the weight of everything sinking in. She had won. Karen was finally going to face the consequences of her actions, and justice would be served. But as the reality of the victory settled in, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of emptiness. The battle had been hard fought, and while the end of Karen's reign felt like a triumph, it also came at a cost. The first thing Sarah did after the trial was to return to the hospital to be with Emma. The doctors had informed her that Emma would make a full recovery, but that didn't mean the trauma of what happened would simply fade away. The damage done wasn't just physical. Emma had endured so much: the gunshot, the fear, and the emotional toll of Karen's cruelty. Sarah had never felt more helpless than she did when she saw her daughter in that hospital bed, bruised and broken, but still fighting. When she entered the room, she found Emma sitting up in bed, the faintest smile on her face as she looked up at her mom. The smile didn't reach her eyes, though, and Sarah could see the lingering sadness in her daughter's gaze. The world had changed for Emma, and though she was physically healing, she still carried the scars of the ordeal. "Hey, sweetheart," Sarah said softly, sitting down beside her. "How are you feeling?" Emma sighed, her small shoulders rising and falling in a tired motion. "Better, I guess. Just everything feels different now, Mom." Sarah reached out and gently brushed a lock of hair from Emma's face, her heart aching with the weight of it all. "I know, baby. I know. But we're going to be okay. We've been through the worst of it, and now we can finally start healing." Emma nodded, but her eyes remained distant, lost in thought. "It's just, I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again, Mom. I don't know if I'll ever trust people the way I used to." Sarah's heart broke at her daughter's words. She had known that Emma would carry the emotional burden of the shooting for a long time, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all the more real. Karen hadn't just stolen Emma's sense of security, she had stolen part of her innocence. But Sarah wasn't going to let her daughter fall into despair. Not now. Not after everything they had fought for. "You don't have to have all the answers right now, sweetheart," Sarah said gently. "It's okay to feel scared. It's okay to be uncertain. But I want you to know that I'll be here. Always. And we'll take it one step at a time, okay?" Emma looked at her mom, her eyes filling with tears that she quickly blinked away. "I just want things to be normal again. I want things to feel safe." Sarah nodded, her own tears threatening to spill over. "I know, but you're not alone in this. We're going to make a new normal. Together." The two of them sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. But it wasn't a suffocating silence. It was one of understanding. Sarah and Emma had been through something unspeakable, but they were still standing, still fighting. They would rebuild their lives, piece by piece. Meanwhile, outside the hospital, Karen's world had begun to unravel. Her name was all over the news now, and the details of her actions had shocked the community. The truth had come out. The manipulation, the lies, the way she had used her power to hurt innocent people. The people who had once feared her now turned their backs on her. Karen was no longer the woman in control. She was just a criminal facing the consequences of her actions. Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of justice in that, but there was no satisfaction in it. Karen had been defeated, yes, but the damage she had caused would never be undone. As Sarah and Emma began the slow process of healing, they found comfort in each other. Sarah took time off from work to be by her daughter's side, the two of them spending quiet afternoons together, talking, reading, and doing whatever they could to rebuild their sense of normalcy. It wasn't easy, but they were learning to live again, to trust again. There were still tough days ahead, of course. Days when the memory of Karen's cruelty would threaten to pull them back into the darkness. But Sarah knew that with every step forward, they were healing. They were becoming stronger, not just as mother and daughter, but as survivors. The road to recovery was long, but Sarah would walk it with her daughter every step of the way. And as the days passed, Sarah's heart filled with a quiet sense of relief. The worst was over. They had fought and won, and now they could finally start to move forward, together. Just when Sarah thought the nightmare was finally over, Karen found one last way to lash out. The morning air was crisp as Sarah sat in her living room, sipping her coffee, trying to enjoy the peace that had finally settled over her and Emma. The ordeal had left its scars, but for the first time in a long while, they were beginning to feel like they could breathe again to rebuild what had been shattered. The doorbell rang. Sarah frowned, wondering who could be at the door. It was early, and they hadn't been expecting anyone. She hesitated, then stood, wiping her palms nervously on her jeans. When she opened the door, she was met with a familiar face, Karen's lawyer standing on her doorstep, holding a thick envelope in his hands. His expression was somber, his eyes avoiding hers as he handed over the papers without a word. "Sarah," he said after a long pause, "this is from Karen." Confusion washed over Sarah. Karen? After everything, after the trial and the way the community had turned against her, Karen was still trying to make moves? The lawyer's eyes flicked up, meeting Sarah's for just a moment before he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, the envelope heavy in her hands. Closing the door behind her, Sarah ripped open the envelope, her heart racing. Inside was a letter from Karen, a letter that was both chilling and strangely calm. Karen had written to Sarah not just as a final attempt to manipulate her, but as a way to claim the last word, the last shred of control. "Dear Sarah," the letter began, "I know you think this is over. You think I've been beaten, that the court has won, and that justice has been served. But I'm still in control. You think you've taken everything from me, but you haven't. You can't destroy what's already been built. You and your daughter will never escape the truth. You'll always remember that I was the one who truly held the power here. That's something you'll never have the luxury of forgetting." Sarah felt the bile rise in her throat as she read those words, but there was something else in the letter, a final bombshell that made her blood run cold. Karen had made an anonymous call to the press, detailing Sarah and Emma's private lives, attempting to paint them as victims of a false narrative spun by a vengeful mother. The journalist involved had already reached out to her, preparing to publish a story that would turn everything around, putting Sarah in a position where she could once again become the subject of public scrutiny. For a moment, Sarah felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Was it possible that all of her efforts, all the work they had done to move forward, could be destroyed in an instant by Karen's final act of revenge? But just as quickly as the panic began to set in, something inside Sarah clicked. This wasn't a victory for Karen, it was a desperate attempt to hold onto the last shred of power she had. Karen wanted to believe that she could still control the narrative, that her words still held weight. But Sarah had already outsmarted her. Taking a deep breath, Sarah set the letter down and walked over to the phone. She knew exactly what to do. She contacted her lawyer, explaining the situation. They would take immediate action, reaching out to the journalist and ensuring that any false information was publicly discredited before it had a chance to spread. But Sarah wasn't just going to rely on her lawyer. She knew this was her final chance to put the story to bed once and for all. Sarah reached out to the same community members who had helped her during the trial. She organized a small press conference, determined to take control of the narrative herself. With Emma at her side, Sarah spoke directly to the press and the community, laying bare the truth of what had happened. She didn't need Karen's lies to define her anymore. As Sarah finished speaking, she saw the change in the crowd. The eyes that had once been full of doubt and suspicion now reflected respect. The air shifted as the truth settled over them, and Sarah realized that she had won in the only way that mattered, not through Karen's defeat, but through the strength she had found within herself and the love she had for her daughter. Later that evening, after the press conference, Sarah and Emma sat together, watching the sunset from the porch. The chaos of the past months felt like it was finally fading, though it had left its mark. The emotional toll had been immense, but they were still standing, still stronger than ever. Karen's attempts to retaliate had failed, and now, with the truth out there, they could finally start to heal. "Are you okay?" Emma asked, her voice soft, her hand resting on Sarah's. Sarah nodded, her heart full. "I am. We made it through, baby, together." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in soft golden light. In that moment, Sarah knew that no matter what had happened in the past, no matter the fight they had endured, they had come out on the other side. The final twist had been Karen's last attempt to destroy them, but Sarah had outsmarted her, and in doing so, she had found the most important victory of all: the power to move forward, to rebuild, and to ensure that nothing and no one would ever take that away from her or her daughter again. Weeks passed since the press conference, and life for Sarah and Emma began to settle into a new rhythm. The weight of the legal battle, the emotional scars, and the constant fear had begun to fade, but the journey was far from over. Karen had been convicted, her manipulations exposed for the world to see, and Sarah had finally taken back control of her own life. Yet, in the quiet moments between the noise of recovery, both Sarah and Emma knew that healing wasn't something that could be rushed or forced. It was a process, one that would take time, patience, and love. It was late afternoon when Sarah and Emma sat together on the porch, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the yard. The sounds of nature filled the air, birds chirping, the wind rustling through the trees, and for the first time in months, the world felt peaceful again. Emma had come a long way since that night, her body healing, but her heart still carrying the weight of everything that had happened. But Sarah could see the small victories in her daughter's smile, in the way she laughed at a joke, in the way she could finally talk about the future without fear. They didn't speak much at first, simply sitting side by side in comfortable silence. Then Emma shifted slightly, her voice tentative as she spoke. "I still think about it a lot, about what happened. I don't think I'll ever forget." Sarah looked at her daughter, her heart aching with understanding. The road to healing was never going to be a straight line. "I know, sweetheart. You don't have to forget. It's part of what made us who we are now." Emma nodded slowly, and for a moment there was a long pause. Finally, Emma turned to her mom, her eyes filled with a kind of quiet wisdom. I think I'm ready to start moving forward. Not forgetting, just living again." A deep sense of relief washed over Sarah, the tears she had been holding back threatening to spill. She reached out and took her daughter's hand in hers, squeezing it gently. "I'm so proud of you. I don't think you'll ever truly understand how strong you are, how brave." Emma smiled faintly, her fingers tracing the lines of her mom's palm. "We made it, didn't we?" "Yes," Sarah said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "We did, and we'll keep making it, every single day." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the two of them sat in the fading light, knowing that despite the scars and the pain, they had emerged from the darkness stronger than before. Karen was gone, her influence shattered, and Sarah had protected her daughter, fighting with everything she had. But more than that, she had learned something about herself, that no matter the odds, no matter the obstacles, she would always be there for Emma, a constant, unshakable force. And as the night settled in, bringing with it a quiet peace, Sarah realized that the true victory wasn't in the courtroom or the headlines or the legal battles won. It was in this moment, in the soft glow of the sunset, in the steady rhythm of Emma's breathing beside her, in the love that had carried them both through the storm. This, right here, was their victory. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, they were ready to face it together. If you've been inspired by Sarah and Emma's journey and want to see more stories of resilience, justice, and strength, be sure to subscribe to our channel HOA, Denied Access. Don't miss out on future content that dives deep into real-life stories, legal battles, and empowering moments. Hit the notification bell so you're always in the loop, and join our community of supporters who believe in standing up for what's right. Subscribe now and be part of the fight for justice.